So we're hitting the ground running on the big story of Nigeria's decision to do away with subsidy on petrol, the higher price levels, and the wider challenge of poor energy that the largest economy in Africa faces. Welcome my guest live here in the studios. Abdul Qudus Isiaka is a senior economist at ProShare Research Nigeria. Thanks for making it here tonight for this conversation. It's good to have you. Let's start with you. As an economist, what are the key issues for you in the ongoing fuel subsidy removal discourse?
Okay, thank you once again for having me. I think central to this whole discussion around the subsidy removal, we've been able to identify a number of issues, 3 or 4. I think number 1 is the issue of escalation of pricing between the coastal price to the forecourt price, right? So there's the ex-coastal price, which really doesn't take into consideration transshipment charges as well as other port charges. Now, the problem with these charges that are borne essentially by independent marketers and depot owners is that it is denominated in foreign currency and they are levied by Nigerian agencies. So the question to ask is, why should Nigerian agencies constitute such a bottleneck? We've been talking about bottlenecks being one of the major factors driving inflation. I think it's high time we talked about that. Now, secondly, you also need to ask questions about how much we consume. Forget about whether we actually consume, we choose to subsidize fuel or not. I think it's just basic decency for a country of our size to know how much we actually consume. Right, this new administration is talking about the integrity of coming up with some integration of national database. And I think that's perhaps where to start from. In 2015, we had numbers around 33 to 35 million liters being bandied. Today, we're talking about 66 billion liters being, consumption by Nigerians. That can't possibly be the case. That's an escalation that cannot be accounted for by population growth or even the size of, enterprise in the economy. So I think that needs to not only be sorted out, it also needs to be investigated, because we know that some Nigerians have become stupendously wealthy from running a racket, around the subsidy regime. Yes. So I think number 3 is whether or not the government could have continued with this subsidy regime. It's obvious that, judging by the debt numbers, 46 trillion naira, debt service to revenue ratio at around 80%, it was becoming a burden to the government. It was an albatross of some sort.
Were Nigerians really being subsidized in the real terms? Well, I went to the dictionary and checked the definition of subsidy. Yeah. Do we really have subsidy for consumption, or we're subsidizing inefficiencies in the system? Okay,
it's obvious that even from these numbers that we're really looking at, Nigerians benefit. And when the IMF says that the subsidy regime is regressive, it says that in the textbook sense of it, relating it to a situation where some of the richer, the people within the higher middle income class and the upper income class tend to benefit more than those in the lower income class. But here we have a situation where a very small, minute fraction of the population that are into the business of selling imported subsidized fuel, and who choose to for the interest of their own pockets and their cronies, choose to sell fuel across the border. I think they are really the ones who benefit the most, and not so much of the Nigerians. So in a way, we mustn't throw away the baby with the bathwater. Nigerians have over the years benefited, albeit to some very limited degree. And as such, I think that the government should look into those areas. We think that transportation as well as electricity will be the most direct impact, those direct areas, right? So in terms of transportation...
Of energy.
Exactly. Right, the subsidy removal, this new regime that we're coming into, that is the subsidy removal regime, is going to be characterized by higher transport costs, especially for commuters. Interestingly, a lot of the haulage and freight that we see by road...
So you're taking me straight to distribution and pricing issues?
Well, if you want to see it that way...
Well, that's what I'm saying. You folks did this very beautiful and quite illustrative distribution and pricing of petroleum products in Nigeria in different scenarios. Yeah. So this is a subsidy regime without local refining. So from what you folks did at ProShare Research, you think refining locally is a major conversation, discourse we should have if we want to have a true subsidy regime?
Yeah, I mean, it's a game changer. We saw the Dangote refineries get launched, yes. 650,000 barrels capacity. That is massive. It should help us with about 30 to 35 million liters. And that is also, to some extent adequate, in trying to help us with our domestic demand for PMS. The question is, for me, is that if you look at this chart, right, what we're discussing there is that we have 3 scenarios. There is the subsidy removal regime where we are now, but there is no, there's still no local refining, which means that we have to import, but then there's still support, right? This is very important. People tend to overlook the fact that the government is still, supporting FX, supporting importation of PMS by way of FX, right? So if that is removed, we may see prices rise from even 500 where we are right now to around 600, 700. So that is one scenario. Scenario 2 is where we remove subsidy, we remove FX support as well, and there's still no local refining. That is, the second most, unpreferable scenario. Then the third and perhaps the best, the most preferred scenario, the best case scenario, if you want to see it that way, is where we remove the subsidy as we have, of course, in order to make for development in many other areas in terms of capital infrastructure, and reduce some of the fiscal burdens that we've been bearing over the years. And of course, we now have domestic refining. And when we have domestic refining, we don't need to pay all these transshipment charges and some of all those port charges denominated in foreign currency. So there is no need, perhaps, really for any support in that regard. So those are the scenarios we're looking at, basically.
So do you think we're communicating, or the government is communicating enough on both the pains and the gains, as it were? It's been bandied about over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So it looks like everybody understands the pains and the gains, but we don't seem to be on the same page, as it were, even with the NLC calling for a strike action in the next 2 days. Yeah,
if you look at what we've done at ProShare, we try to map out what the pains and the gains are, what the benefits and the costs of subsidy removal are. And the point we're able to, depict clearly is that the pains are going to be in the short term. Most of the pains are going to be short term. And most of the gains are going to be in the long term. It means that in the intervening period, there is a need for the government to step in. And that's why we're talking about some very important targeted interventions by the government. Okay, so we're looking at pains like higher inflation, higher cost of living, transport costs. It could even, filter into food and food inflation and prices of other commodities across the country. And services, by the way. Now, if you look at the gains, we're looking at some medium to long-term gains, like an improvement in our debt service revenue ratio, reduction in our deficit to GDP ratio, an improvement in our debt stock, as well as some of the fiscal numbers that help us with our credit sovereign rating. Now, if you now if you want to understand why the government needs to come in, right, you could look at a number of issues. MBS numbers released yesterday, or a couple of days ago, I think 4 days ago, we had household consumption or spending, if you like, reduced by 12% in Q4. It contracted by 5% in Q3. There is a progressive reduction in household spending, and I think that the subsidy removal, if not well managed, could aggravate even that. Yes,
those figures.
And if you look at the makeup of our GDP, household spending represents the largest. And over the years, that has been buffeted by high inflation, high interest rates, high taxes, high effective taxes, not necessarily government taxes, which means that it may not necessarily be remitted to government coffers. But
we understand what that means.
Yeah, effective taxes paid to non-state actors. So if you take all of those into consideration, I think there's a need for the government. Again, if you compare, minimum wage in Nigeria to some of our peer comparable countries, in Indonesia, you're looking at a minimum wage of around $173 per month. In Nigeria, you're looking at $95 per month. Of course, that is after taking into consideration the 40% increase announced, yet to be effected increase in minimum wage. In countries like Pakistan, it's $111.
Can Nigeria afford wage increase right now, June 2023?
Well, I think that we need to be. I believe Nigeria can.
Do we have the money?
We can afford some amount of, palliatives, and I think that
you're sticking to me now like an economist.
Yeah, we can afford some palliatives, and I think that we can commit to some improvements in, minimum wage. I mean, if you look at the numbers.
We can commit, but do we have the cash on the table? Ways and means is where we're above our heads.
Yes, we are looking at a 3.35 trillion naira. What we budgeted for this year was 6.7 trillion naira in subsidy. Of course, in the full year scenario.
We haven't cash back.
In the full year scenario. Yes, we haven't cash back, and then NPC is carrying that as a receivable in its account. But I believe that some of the savings from this subsidy removal can be, to some extent. I think it needs some, permutations, calculations, but the government need not commit to what it cannot. Of course, it's not going to be acceptable for the government to commit to what it cannot.
We've got 40% we haven't paid. There's a 40%.
Yes, the 40%, is retroactive, right? It's retroactive, and I do think that it was budgeted for. It was actually budgeted for this year. Now, whether or not the government is going to be doing that, I think it again depends on how they manage their books. But the government mustn't pretend not to, take into consideration, not to realize that this is going to be very, very severe for the average household. I think it's very important. By how much minimum wages are increased is something that they would have to negotiate with, unions. But beyond even unions, and that's why we're talking about these targeted interventions. There is a need to talk about. There's a need to talk about the implications for micro businesses, especially those that do not run on diesel-fired generating plants. Those that don't run on gas-fired generating plants. So there is a need. Yeah, exactly. So there is a need for some support, improvement in electricity, as well as our gas expansion plant. Transport and electricity can take advantage of our 206 trillion standard cubic feet of gas that we sit on in reserves.
Well, that's a wider energy conversation.
Exactly. If we're able to domesticate our gas, value chain, I think some of this, we're already seeing LPG drop in many markets.
So that could bring some palliatives.
Yeah, exactly. Those are some of the things the government needs to be talking about.
We can do about that. We'll have this conversation again beyond this. Thank you so much for coming. Abdul Qudus Isiaka, who is a senior economist at ProShare Nigeria. Thank you so much for your time.